Do you like Hercule Poirot? If so, then comment. I will appreciate your comment. I'm your host for today's mystery, and together we'll step into the world of the brilliant Belgian detective Hercule Poirot in The Last Will of Margaret Raines. This is a story woven with hidden identities, long-buried family secrets, and a decades-old crime that finally resurfaces to demand justice. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from today? Share your location in the comments below. Now, grab your favorite drink, perhaps a tisane, just as Poirot himself might enjoy, and join me as we dive into this intriguing case, narrated through the eyes of his loyal friend, Captain Hastings. Now let's disclose chapters. Chapter 1. The Summons from Surrey. It was a crisp autumn morning when I returned to London after several months in Argentina, where I had been tending to personal business. The familiar bustle of the city, the rattle of carriages, the steady rhythm of hurried footsteps, and the grey skies that hung over the rooftops felt strangely comforting after the wide, endless plains of South America. Almost instinctively, I knew my first visit must be to my old companion, Hercule Poirot. I found him precisely where I expected, in his immaculate flat at Whitehaven Mansions, arranging a display of silver trinkets upon the mantelpiece with his usual obsessive symmetry. His whole face lit up the moment he spotted me. "Hastings, mon ami, you return at last." He gripped both my hands warmly, his famous moustache twitching with satisfaction. "All is well with you, I hope?" "Quite well," I assured him, as I took the chair he indicated, placed at a perfect angle to the fire. "Argentina has been kind, but I have missed London, and of course, your investigations." His eyes sparkled mischievously. "The adventures of Hercule Poirot, they still fascinate you, eh? Then your timing, my friend, could not be more fortunate." He moved to his desk and retrieved a thick cream-colored envelope. "This," he said, handing it to me with a flourish, "arrived this very morning." The letter bore the seal of Weatherby, Harrington and Sons, solicitors of respectable reputation. I unfolded the paper and read aloud. "Mr. Poirot, I write to you regarding a matter of some urgency, concerning the estate of the late Margaret Raines of Oakenhurst, Surrey. Circumstances surrounding her sudden passing 2 nights ago have raised questions I cannot discuss in writing. Your discretion and skill compel me to seek your guidance before any legal steps are taken. I would be grateful if you could call upon me at your earliest convenience. Yours sincerely, Edward Weatherby, Esquire." "Margaret Raines," I mused, handing the letter back. "The name is faintly familiar." "Indeed," Poirot replied, adjusting his bow tie before a mirror. "The widow of Sir William Raines, the great industrialist, a woman of standing, no children, no immediate heirs, and yes, Hastings, she is now deceased." "Of natural causes?" I asked. Poirot's eyebrow arched. "That, mon ami, is precisely the matter we are invited to question. The letter is too cautious, too carefully phrased. It hides more than it says." A flicker of excitement stirred in me. "You intend to accept, then? But of course, and you will accompany me." His reflection in the mirror turned, eyes hopeful. "As if I could refuse. When do we leave?" "At 2 o'clock. That gives us ample time for luncheon at your favorite little restaurant before we meet Mr. Weatherby." Over lunch, Poirot provided what little background he knew. Margaret Raines had been well respected in philanthropic circles, admired for her charitable work, and had amassed considerable fortune with no direct heirs. By the time we reached the oak-panelled offices of Weatherby, Harrington and Sons, my curiosity was thoroughly sharpened. Inside, shelves of heavy law books lined the walls, and the scent of polished wood mingled with old paper. Edward Weatherby himself, a thin, nervous man with prematurely grey hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, greeted us politely, and ushered us into leather chairs. "Thank you for coming, gentlemen," he said, fiddling with his glasses. Poirot declined the tea offered with a simple wave. "If you would, Mr. Weatherby, proceed to the matter at hand," Poirot prompted. Weatherby clasped his hands. "Mrs. Raines passed away quietly in her bed, or so her physician Dr. Henderson assures us. Yet there are circumstances I find troubling. The day before her death, she summoned me to Oakenhurst. She wished to alter her will." He paused, clearly unsettled. This was not unusual. She reviewed her estate often, but this time she declared she intended to name an entirely new beneficiary. She spoke of it openly to her household, yet refused to reveal the name, even to me, saying only that justice will at last be done. She promised to give me the final document the following day. That day never came. "The will was never found?" I asked. "Exactly. Her existing will leaves most of her fortune to charitable institutions with modest provisions for household staff. The estate itself would go to a distant cousin, Miss Judith Raines, but the new will, whatever it contained, has vanished entirely." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A wealthy lady announces a drastic change, and before it can be formalized, she dies in her bed. That is intriguing, n'est-ce pas?" Weatherby nodded gravely. "Mrs. Raines was in excellent health. Dr. Henderson himself remarked on it only a week earlier, and there was more. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Lacey, confided that on the evening before her death, she overheard raised voices in the study. Mrs. Raines was in heated argument with her companion, Miss Porter. She distinctly heard Mrs. Raines mention the boy. But to my knowledge, no such boy exists in the household." Poirot leaned back, fingertips forming his habitual triangle. "When may we see Oakenhurst?" "The staff expects you this evening," Weatherby replied. "Très bien. Then we depart at once." Poirot rose, pausing only to ask, "One last matter, monsieur. Did Mrs. Raines ever hint at this new heir before?" Weatherby hesitated. 2 months ago, she inquired about the legalities of adopting an adult. She never mentioned it again." Poirot's eyes glittered, the unmistakable look of a hunter catching scent of prey. "That, my friend Hastings, is most illuminating." As our taxi carried us toward the train station, I reflected on the puzzle before us. A wealthy widow, a mysterious heir, a sudden death, and a vanished will. "What do you think of it, Poirot?" I asked. "It is too early to judge, Hastings. Yet already one fact is clear. Someone did not wish this new will to exist. The question is, who? And to what lengths would they go to prevent it?" I looked out the window as London's grey stone gave way to Surrey's countryside, Oakenhurst and its secrets waiting ahead, ready to be uncovered by Poirot's little grey cells. Chapter 2. Shadows at Oakenhurst. The first glimpse of Oakenhurst came as our taxi wound steadily up the long gravel drive. The house seemed to reveal itself in fragments, like a secret reluctant to be shared. The late afternoon sun was sinking low, painting the lawns in amber light and stretching the trees' shadows until they seemed almost like dark fingers pointing toward the manor. The great house, with its ivy-clad brickwork and stately Queen Anne architecture, stood in solemn dignity, a monument to old wealth and older secrets. Poirot leaned forward in his seat, his eyes glittering with keen interest. "Regarde, mon ami," he murmured. "Do you not find that such houses breathe as though they are alive? They hold in their walls whispers of the past, tragedies, betrayals, perhaps even murder." I followed his gaze, struck by the uncanny stillness of the estate. "It certainly has the look of a place with stories best left untold," I agreed, noting how the many-paned windows caught the dying light as though the house itself were watching us. At the great oak doors, a somber-faced butler awaited, his bearing precise and dignified. "Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings, I presume. Mr. Weatherby telephoned of your arrival. I am Perkins. Kindly follow me." His voice carried the finality of a man accustomed to solemn duty. The entrance hall was lofty and imposing, its walls adorned with ancestral portraits and hunting trophies. Each oil-painted gaze seemed to follow us as we crossed the marble floor. Perkins ushered us into a drawing room where several figures had gathered, their expressions tight with anticipation, like actors waiting for the curtain to rise. "May I present Colonel Robert Burrows?" Perkins intoned. The first to step forward was a tall, upright man whose military training was stamped into every line of his posture. "Served with Sir William during the Boer War," he introduced himself briskly. "Dreadful business, this. Margaret's passing has unsettled us all." Next was a severe-looking woman in her 40s, dressed in understated black. "Judith Raines," she said crisply. Her strong features bore a striking resemblance to the stern family portraits we had just passed. "Second cousin, once removed. I've been residing here since the news reached me." The introductions continued. A delicate, bird-like woman with restless eyes spoke in a wavering voice. "Evelyn Porter. I served as Mrs. Raines's companion for more than 2 decades." Something in her nervous manner suggested a mind too quick to worry. A stocky gentleman with grey hair and a genial bedside air followed. "Dr. James Henderson," he announced warmly. "Physician to Mrs. Raines these past 10 years. She was a most remarkable lady." Hovering near the door was Mrs. Lacey, the housekeeper, whose deep curtsy was accompanied by a deferential smile. Perkins completed his duty, then retreated with professional discretion. Poirot inclined his head. "Mesdames et messieurs, it is a privilege to meet you, though I grieve at the reason for my presence. Mr. Weatherby has asked for my assistance in matters concerning the late Mrs. Raines's estate." Colonel Burrows gave a dismissive harumph. "Entirely unnecessary. Margaret's affairs were always meticulous. I fail to see why a detective should meddle." Poirot's lips curved in mild amusement. "Ah, but you are already well acquainted with my profession, Colonel." "Everyone knows who you are, Monsieur Poirot," Judith Raines replied with a faint, almost mocking smile. "Though I too question why you've been summoned." Dr. Henderson cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps Mr. Weatherby seeks to ensure matters are handled properly, considering the rather unusual circumstances before Margaret's passing." Miss Porter's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. "You mean her talk of changing the will?" she whispered. "Indeed," said Poirot softly. Colonel Burrows gave a sharp laugh. "She dropped that bombshell over dinner. After years of funneling her fortune into charities, suddenly she speaks of some mysterious heir, completely unknown to us all. No explanation, just a declaration that justice would finally prevail." I asked, "Did Mrs. Raines offer no hint of her reasons?" Judith's eyes flicked to the others. Only that long overdue justice would be done. She had a dramatic streak. "She seemed transformed that night," Miss Porter added quietly, "almost feverish. I was concerned for her well-being." "Nonsense," Dr. Henderson interrupted firmly. "Her health was excellent. I examined her a week prior, strong as an ox for her years. That is what made her sudden death so bewildering." "And yet," Poirot mused, "death does not always consult the physician's calendar. Tell me, doctor, of what cause did she die?" "Natural causes," Henderson replied, though unease flickered across his face. "Heart failure in her sleep. Not uncommon at her age." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the room where she passed away, it remains untouched." Judith sniffed. "This is a home, Monsieur Poirot, not a shrine." Of course it has been cleaned, though her belongings remain. Mr. Weatherby instructed they not be disturbed further. Then perhaps, Poirot said gently, Captain Hastings and I may look upon the room. It would help me understand the lady who has left us. Miss Porter sprang to her feet, as though eager to escape the drawing-room's tension. Certainly. Allow me. We ascended the grand staircase, our steps echoing in the hushed corridor, portraits of long-dead Rain's ancestors glaring down like stern judges. At the end of the hall, Miss Porter opened a pair of double doors to reveal Margaret's suite. The room was both stately and intimate. A canopy bed dressed in burgundy silk, a writing desk gleaming in one corner, French doors opening to a balcony where the last of daylight lingered. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish. Everything remains as she left it, Miss Porter explained nervously. Her clothing still hangs in the wardrobe, her books in place. The only change is fresh linens for the bed. Poirot's gaze sharpened at the mention of her papers. Ah, and her correspondence? Would that include the rumoured new will? Miss Porter shook her head. We searched thoroughly. Mr. Weatherby himself oversaw it. Nothing was found. Poirot traced a finger along the polished surface of the desk. And here she wrote her letters, always in her own hand? Yes. She insisted on it, even now when everyone relies on the telephone. Poirot's voice softened, but his question struck like a blade. I understand, mademoiselle. There was a disagreement between you and Mrs. Raines shortly before her death. Her cheeks flushed. Who told you that? Mrs. Lacey, no doubt. It was nothing, just a trivial quarrel about the household. Not about the boy, Poirot asked casually. Her composure faltered. Her face went pale. I don't know what you mean. Before the silence could deepen, raised voices drifted from downstairs. Mrs. Lacey appeared, breathless. Mr. Poirot, sir. A gentleman has arrived asking for Mrs. Raines. When informed of her passing, he grew terribly agitated. We hurried down to find Colonel Burrows restraining a pale young man, perhaps no more than 20. His hands shook as he protested. I had a letter from Mrs. Raines. She summoned me here for today. It was urgent. Miss Raines's voice cut through sharply. Monsieur Poirot, perhaps you can settle this. None of us have ever seen this young man before, and yet he claims a connection with my cousin. The stranger's eyes pleaded for understanding. My name is Thomas Grant. Please, someone tell me what is going on. I saw Poirot's eyes light with that unmistakable gleam, the look of a man who has just glimpsed the outline of truth beneath layers of deception. He stepped forward with a courteous bow. Enchanté, Monsieur Grant. Pray tell us, what was the nature of your correspondence with the late Mrs. Raines? Even as Thomas opened his mouth to answer, I noticed Miss Porter quietly slipping out of the room, her expression etched with alarm. Outside, the last rays of sunlight had disappeared, and Oakenhurst seemed to fold itself deeper into shadow, as though guarding the secrets we had only begun to uncover. Chapter 3. A Tapestry of Deception. The unexpected arrival of Thomas Grant cast Oakenhurst into a state of uneasy disorder. Now seated in a deep armchair near the fire, the young man looked both bewildered and burdened by the strange situation into which he had stumbled. His manner was neat, his clothes modest but carefully tended, and his open, earnest features gave the impression of someone more accustomed to hard work than privilege. I received this letter a week ago, he explained nervously, producing an envelope from his inside pocket. His fingers trembled slightly as he handed it to Poirot. I had never met Mrs. Raines, at least not to my knowledge, but she asked me to come. Poirot unfolded the paper with deliberate care, holding it up to the light. The thick cream stationery bore the same embossed crest I had earlier noticed on Margaret Raines's writing desk. In his soft Belgian accent, Poirot read aloud, "Dear Mr. Grant, circumstances have come to my attention which necessitate our meeting. I would be most grateful if you would call at Oakenhurst on the 15th at 3 o'clock. The matter concerns your future and is, I assure you, of the utmost importance to us both. Yours sincerely, Margaret Raines." When he had finished, Poirot looked up, his gaze sharpening. "And you had no prior acquaintance with this lady? No knowledge of her interest in you?" "None whatsoever," Thomas replied firmly. "I assumed it might be linked to St. Mary's Orphanage, where I was raised. Perhaps Mrs. Raines was a benefactor." Colonel Burrows gave a snort of derision. "A convenient tale. He could have penned the letter himself for all we know." "That would be most unjust," Poirot said calmly, folding the paper. "The handwriting matches perfectly with the documents Mr. Weatherby showed us. Besides, the young man arrived here unaware that Mrs. Raines had died. Hardly the behavior of a forger." Miss Judith Raines fixed the visitor with a frosty stare. "The timing is highly suspect. My cousin announces a sudden change to her will, then dies before it can be enacted, and lo, here comes this stranger claiming her invitation." Grant flushed with indignation. "I make no claim beyond the letter. I came because I was asked. I knew nothing of her death, nor of any will." Dr. Henderson, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Let us not leap to conclusions. The boy's account has the ring of truth. The real question is, why would Margaret summon him at all?" All eyes turned to Poirot. He nodded thoughtfully. "Precisely. To solve the riddle, we must know more. Monsieur Grant, tell us of your life, s'il vous plaît." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "There's little to say. I was left as an infant at St. Mary's. My parents were never identified. I was educated there, thanks to anonymous benefactors, and now I work as a clerk at Barrington's Publishing in London." "Anonymous benefactors," Colonel Burrows repeated skeptically. "How very neat." "It is hardly unusual," Dr. Henderson countered. "Many prefer to give without seeking recognition." Poirot leaned forward. "And during the war, monsieur? Did you serve?" "Yes, sir. I enlisted with the Royal Fusiliers. I was wounded at Passchendaele in 1917 and spent half a year in hospital before being sent home." For an instant, a strange flicker passed across Burrows's face. Something like recognition, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Poirot inclined his head. "We shall, of course, verify your history. In the meantime, it would be best if you remained here at Oakenhurst. The hour is late, and there is more yet to unravel." Judith bristled. "I hardly think—" But Poirot's tone was firm, brooking no dissent. "If he is indeed the person named in Mrs. Raines's intended will, his presence is essential." Dr. Henderson gave a decisive nod. "I agree. Margaret summoned him for a reason. He has as much right to answers as anyone here." At that moment, Evelyn Porter re-entered quietly, as though she had been listening all along. "The blue room in the East Wing is ready," she said. "I'll see to Mr. Grant's comfort myself." After escorting Grant from the room, Poirot turned to the others. "Now, mes amis, I should like to speak with each of you privately. Dr. Henderson, if you please, perhaps you would begin." The physician settled into his chair with a weary sigh. "I suppose you wish to know more about her health?" "Indeed," Poirot replied. "As I have said, she was remarkably robust for her years. Her heart, her lungs, her digestion, all excellent. She walked daily, rain or shine. Her mind was clear, her spirit strong. And yet she died of heart failure," I pointed out. The doctor shifted, uneasy. "That was my assessment, yes. Peaceful in her sleep. But—" He hesitated, lowering his voice. "I confess, something troubled me. There was a bluish tinge to her lips and fingertips, more pronounced than one would expect from natural causes. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "You considered poison?" Henderson looked startled. "Poison? Good heavens, no. At least, not then. But now, I cannot rule it out." "Would an autopsy reveal the truth?" Poirot asked. "Possibly," the doctor admitted, "though time has passed and the family may object." Poirot nodded gravely. "And tell me, on the day of her death, was anything unusual? A visitor? A delivery?" Henderson frowned. "Nothing stands out. She worked in her study during the morning, took her luncheon in her room, and retired early, complaining of a headache. I do not know who carried her tray, perhaps one of the maids, or Mrs. Lacey." "You have been most helpful, Doctor," Poirot said gently. When the doctor departed, I turned to my friend. "Well, Poirot, what do you make of it?" "It is early yet for conclusions, Hastings," he said, tapping his chin. "But I see already that this household is a web of secrets. Tomorrow we must examine her study with care. If the new will exists, it must be hidden. And young Grant, do you believe his story?" "For now, yes. His shock seemed genuine. But his connection to Margaret Raines is deeper than even he imagines." Our conversation was interrupted as Miss Porter returned. "Mr. Grant is settled in the blue room," she announced, her fingers nervously adjusting the brooch at her collar. "Dinner will be served in half an hour." "Perfectly," Poirot replied smoothly. Then his gaze fixed upon her. "But before that, Miss Porter, I should like a word with you, in private." Her composure faltered. "Of course," she whispered. "The morning room will do." As we followed her through the dim corridors, I observed the stiffness in her walk, the faint tremor in her hands. Whatever she knew about Margaret Raines, or about Thomas Grant, it weighed heavily on her, and Poirot, I knew, would waste no time in peeling away her carefully guarded secret before the night was over. Chapter 4. The Correspondence Conundrum. The morning room at Oakenhurst was a modest yet graceful chamber, its French windows opening onto a rose garden that must have been glorious in summer. Now, in the fading weeks of autumn, the garden appeared forlorn, bare branches and tangled stems awaiting the gardener's shears. Inside, Miss Porter sat perched on the edge of an armchair, her slender frame drawn tight, her fingers clasped firmly in her lap. There was something distinctly bird-like about her, quick, nervous glances darting from Poirot to myself, as though any sudden movement might startle her into flight. "You wished to speak with me, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her voice steady, though I thought I detected a faint quiver beneath the words. "Indeed, mademoiselle," Poirot replied smoothly, lowering himself into a chair opposite her. "It concerns your dispute with Madame Raines on the evening prior to her death. Specifically the matter involving the young man." Miss Porter's hands tightened, the knuckles paling. "It was nothing significant," she said quickly. "And yet, Mrs. Lacey heard voices raised," Poirot reminded her gently. "A trifle does not usually provoke such volume, non?" Her gaze slipped toward the garden, as though seeking refuge in the grey tangle of rose bushes. Margaret had lately become absorbed in certain charitable causes, she admitted at last. "I worried she might be taken advantage of. I only wished to protect her." "And this boy you mentioned," Poirot pressed softly. "Was he, by chance, Mr. Thomas Grant?" A faint flush spread across her cheeks. "I cannot say. Mrs. Raines received countless letters requesting aid. She was generous to a fault." Poirot leaned forward, his tone kind but unyielding. "Come, mademoiselle. You were her companion for 2 decades. Surely she confided something of her intentions to you, For a moment, I thought she might break down entirely, but she drew in a deep breath and steadied herself. Mrs. Raines was a private woman. There were matters she shared with no one. The will, her announcement about it, was as much a surprise to me as it was to the rest of the household. Poirot studied her in silence for several beats, his eyes unreadable. Then he shifted the conversation. "Very well, I should like to see her study, if you would be so good as to lead us there." Relief flickered across her face, though it was quickly masked. "Of course, this way." The study, located in the east wing, was a striking room lined with dark oak shelves. A wide mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface immaculate. Pens and inkstands neatly aligned, correspondence stacked into precise piles. The orderliness of it all seemed almost military in discipline. "Madame was fastidious," Poirot observed approvingly. "Yes," Miss Porter agreed quickly. "She insisted everything remain in its place." Poirot circled the room slowly, his gaze lingering on each detail. "And has anything been disturbed since her passing?" "Only by Mr. Weatherby, the solicitor," she replied. "He searched for the revised will, but handled everything with great care. He returned each item to its original position." With a nod, Poirot bent over the desk, sifting carefully through the letters. Much of it was routine. Social invitations, acknowledgements of charitable donations, and documents concerning investments. Still, his sharp eyes moved over every page with measured attention. "Tell me, Miss Porter," I asked, "did Mrs. Raines keep a diary or a private journal?" For the briefest instant, something flashed across her face, alarm, perhaps, or unease, before she masked it. "Not to my knowledge, Captain Hastings." Poirot did not look up. "Ah, but a woman so precise, so orderly, it is difficult to imagine her not recording her thoughts. N'est-ce pas?" She drew herself straighter, her composure tightening. "I truly cannot say, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot drifted toward the bookshelves, trailing his fingers lightly across the spines. An educated woman, he mused. French, German, and, Tennyson. He plucked a slim volume from its place and opened it. A favorite poet, perhaps. A flicker passed across Miss Porter's face, too fleeting for most to notice, but not missed by Poirot. "Yes," she admitted softly. "Margaret adored Tennyson." Poirot turned a few pages, pausing for a fraction of a second before snapping the book shut and returning it to the shelf. "Très bien. And now, mademoiselle, might we visit Madame's bedchamber once more? In the daylight there are details I wish to reconsider." The bedroom, bathed now in the pale light of morning, felt less oppressive than it had in the candlelit hours before. Like the study, it was orderly to the point of austerity. A small desk sat neatly by the window, while beside the bed, a modest stack of books suggested a nightly reading habit. "Madame enjoyed reading before retiring, I think?" Poirot asked. "Yes," Miss Porter confirmed softly. "She never went to sleep without at least an hour with her books." Poirot bent low, studying the bedside table, his keen eyes darting over the smallest details. Methodically, he began to move about the chamber, examining objects as though each carried a silent testimony of its owner's final hours. I knew that Poirot's little grey cells were at work, fitting pieces together into a pattern that none of us yet saw. The small rosewood box on Margaret Raines's dressing table drew Poirot's attention for a moment. "A jewellery case," he murmured, opening it delicately. Inside lay several modest pieces: brooches, pearl earrings, a gold watch, simple tokens suitable for everyday wear. Miss Porter, who had followed us, explained with a nervous twist of her hands, Her finer pieces were always kept downstairs, locked in the wall safe. Among them, a ruby necklace belonging to Sir William's mother. It has been in the family for generations. Poirot inclined his head. An heirloom of significance, then. I should very much like to see this safe. We were led into a narrow anteroom beside the library, where a large landscape painting hung inconspicuously against the far wall. Miss Porter tugged it aside to reveal a stout iron door fitted snugly into the masonry. "Do you know the combination, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked, his tone polite but probing. She shook her head quickly. "No, only Mr. Weatherby, the solicitor, holds the code. Mrs. Raines trusted no one else with it." "Précisément," Poirot replied, stepping back. "Then we must wait for Mr. Weatherby's return before investigating further." His eyes lingered on the safe for a moment longer, then he turned abruptly. "Now, if you would excuse us, there is a gentleman in the billiards room with whom I should like to have words." We found Colonel Burrows hunched over the green felt, chalking his cue with deliberate care. He looked up as we entered, his manner brisk, even defensive. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot. Come to question me, I dare say." "Not to interrogate, Colonel," Poirot said mildly, "only to converse." He gestured for Miss Porter to leave, and after a slight hesitation she obeyed, closing the door behind her. The Colonel struck a ball with unnecessary force, sending it careening across the table. "I knew her husband, William," he said gruffly. "A finer soldier you wouldn't find. When he died, I saw it as my duty to keep an eye on Margaret, out of loyalty." "Most admirable," Poirot acknowledged softly. "And yet you were present when she declared her wish to alter her will." The Colonel's face hardened. "A damned odd business. Margaret always handled her affairs with the utmost propriety. Then, out of the blue, she proclaims her intention to change everything, to benefit some young fellow none of us had ever heard of, highly unlike her." "Did she provide you with any explanation?" Poirot pressed. "None. Only said she had made a discovery, something requiring immediate action. She was to meet Weatherby the next day, and then—" He paused, lowering his voice. "Then she was dead." "You find this suspicious?" Poirot asked evenly. The Colonel's eyes narrowed. "Coincidences exist, but I don't trust them. Still, I'm not a man for insinuations." Poirot's gaze flickered, but his voice remained calm. "And what of this Thomas Grant?" The Colonel gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Never seen him before today. Can't imagine why Margaret would bring him here. Seems too neat, his arrival after her announcement. Too neat by half." Poirot raised a finger. "And yet, Colonel, were you aware that Madame Raines had recently made inquiries regarding adoption procedures?" The Colonel's cue froze mid-stroke. "Adoption? At her age? Absurd." "Perhaps not for herself," Poirot suggested softly. "Perhaps for another." The soldier frowned, perplexed. "I don't follow." Poirot let the silence draw out before shifting the subject. "I understand Miss Judith Raines is a cousin of the deceased." The Colonel relaxed slightly. "Distant cousin, second or third removed, I can never keep track. She appeared 6 months ago, claiming she wished to reconnect with family. Margaret, being sentimental about such things, welcomed her in. My impression? Quiet, polite, though I've wondered if she had expectations about the estate. Margaret's announcement can't have pleased her." Poirot gave a small nod. "I shall speak with her next. You say she spends her time in the conservatory?" "Yes," the Colonel replied. "She has a fondness for plants. We left him there, and as we walked through the passage, I seized my chance." "Poirot," I whispered, "earlier in the library, you found something in Mrs. Raines's copy of Tennyson. What was it?" Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming. Ah, mon ami, you are learning to notice. Several poems bore the marks of repeated reading, but one in particular, Enoch Arden. Lines had been underlined. It is the tale of a man believed dead, who returns to find his wife wed to another. Tell me, Hastings, is that not most curious? Before I could answer, our progress was interrupted. The doors of the conservatory burst open, and Mrs. Lacey came rushing out, her face ashen, one hand clutching at her throat. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot," she gasped, her voice trembling. "You must come at once, Miss Porter, in the garden. Something dreadful has happened." Poirot and I exchanged a quick glance, then hurried after her, our steps echoing against the stone floor as we passed through the conservatory and out into the shadowy gardens beyond. Chapter 5. Benevolence Unveiled. We hurried after Mrs. Lacey, her steps quick and urgent as she led us through the glass doors of the conservatory and out into the fading garden. The once celebrated grounds of Oakenhurst had lost their summer brilliance. Flower beds stripped back for winter, rose canes pruned to bare thorns, and a scattering of dry leaves whispering across the gravel. By the edge of a small ornamental pond, framed with stone benches, we came upon a startling sight. Miss Porter sat slumped forward on one of the benches, her skin deathly pale, lips tinged an alarming blue. A silver teacup lay toppled at her side, a few amber drops of liquid clinging stubbornly to its rim. Poirot was instantly at her side, his gaze sharp and calculating, though his hands did not touch her. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. "Just moments," Mrs. Lacey answered breathlessly, wringing her hands. "I came to invite her for tea in the conservatory. She didn't respond. I sent Perkins to fetch Dr. Henderson immediately." "Bon. Hastings, you will remain here. Do not touch the cup or move her. Mrs. Lacey, gather the household in the drawing room at once. No one is to slip away." His tone allowed no argument. As the others dispersed, I watched anxiously over the unconscious woman. Each shallow breath rattled faintly in her throat, and the discoloration of her lips echoed the same dreadful signs we had seen in Margaret Raines herself. It was not long before Poirot returned with Dr. Henderson in tow. The physician bent swiftly over the stricken woman, muttering to himself as he checked her pulse. "Rapid, irregular," he said grimly. "Respiration dangerously weak. Pupils reacting sluggishly. These symptoms—" He broke off and glanced at Poirot with a meaning too clear to be spoken aloud. "Match those of Madame Raines," Poirot supplied softly. "Hastings, assist the doctor in moving her upstairs. I will linger here a moment." While we carried Miss Porter with great care toward her chambers, Poirot crouched by the stone bench, magnifying glass in hand. His methodical eyes traced every inch of ground, the tipped teacup, the faint ring of moisture staining the bench. I saw him pluck something minute from the grass, which he folded neatly into his handkerchief before slipping it into his pocket. Once Miss Porter had been laid in bed with Dr. Henderson attending, Poirot gathered the household in the drawing room. A taut silence filled the space as we entered, faces etched with unease. "What has happened?" Colonel Burrows demanded, his voice roughened with suppressed anger. "Miss Porter has taken gravely ill," Poirot replied gravely. "Dr. Henderson tends her now." "Will she live?" asked Judith Raines, her tone betraying interest rather than compassion. "That, mademoiselle, is uncertain. But I can say this much. She has been poisoned." The announcement sent a collective gasp through the room. Mrs. Lacey covered her mouth in horror. Burrows stiffened as though preparing for battle. Thomas Grant remained motionless, his expression unreadable. "Poisoned?" Judith whispered, half in disbelief. Then Mrs. Raines was also murdered," Poirot said firmly, cutting her short. "There is no curse, no cruel coincidence, only deliberate malice carried out twice within this house." The effect of his words rippled through the assembly. The colonel's jaw clenched, rage simmering beneath his outward composure. Even the more stoic members shifted uneasily, glancing at one another with suspicion. "None of you may depart Oakenhurst," Poirot declared, raising a hand for silence. "Until Inspector Forrester of Scotland Yard arrives tomorrow, you will remain. This is not a polite request. It is necessity." The colonel bristled. "You have no authority, sir, to confine us like prisoners." "Perhaps not in law," Poirot admitted coolly. "But if you value justice for Mrs. Raines, you will heed me. Otherwise, it may be said you assisted her killer." His quiet words carried more weight than any command could. Reluctantly, even the colonel subsided. Leaving the uneasy company behind, Poirot beckoned Weatherby, who had been seated discreetly near the corner. Together, we went to Mrs. Raines's study, where the solicitor produced a slim folder from the desk. "The documents concerning adoption," Weatherby explained. "She asked me to prepare research on the legality of adopting an adult heir. Quite unusual, though permissible under certain conditions." Poirot scanned the pages with swift, darting eyes. "And what reason did she give?" "Only that it was a personal matter. At first, she disguised it as hypothetical. Later, she hinted there was something, or someone, specific, though she refused to elaborate." "Did she ever mention St. Mary's Orphanage?" Poirot asked, his voice deceptively mild. Weatherby looked startled. "Indeed, yes. She had supported them with donations for years." "Why do you—" I interjected. "Because Thomas Grant told us he was raised there." Poirot inclined his head. "And now, monsieur, I will see the contents of Mrs. Raines's safe." Weatherby led us into the small anteroom adjoining the library. Behind a pastoral landscape painting, he revealed the safe and deftly worked the combination. With a metallic groan, the heavy door swung wide, revealing its guarded treasures within. The interior of the safe revealed a small but telling collection. Several velvet jewel cases, bundles of neatly bound legal papers, and, most intriguingly, a slim, leather-bound book. Poirot's eyes lingered on it immediately, his instincts fastening on what seemed most inconspicuous. "Is this the entirety of her effects?" he asked quietly. "As far as I know," Weatherby admitted, "I haven't examined it in detail since her passing." With deliberate care, Poirot opened the book. A quick glance through its pages confirmed what he suspected. It was Mrs. Raines's private diary. His sharp eyes scanned the handwriting, pausing once or twice before he closed it with a decisive snap. "Monsieur Weatherby," he said gravely, "we must leave at once for London. There are matters that can only be clarified at St. Mary's Orphanage. In the meantime, keep this diary safe until I request it again." Weatherby hesitated. "But surely, Monsieur Poirot, you can tell me at least something of what you expect to find?" Poirot shook his head gently. "In due course, monsieur. For now, discretion is paramount." The diary was returned to the safe, the heavy door swung closed, and the lock spun into place once more. Poirot's mind, however, had already moved beyond Oakenhurst. Our drive to London passed mostly in silence. Poirot sat with arms folded, his keen gaze fixed on the window, but his thoughts far away. Only as the outlines of the city began to take shape did he finally turn to me. "You noticed the lips of Mademoiselle Porter Hastings? Bluish, yes? Exactly as Dr. Henderson described with poor Mrs. Raines." "Précisément. And you saw what I picked up beside the bench?" "Only that you slipped something into your handkerchief," I admitted. From his pocket, Poirot produced the folded cloth and unwrapped it. Inside was a tiny glass vial, no larger than a finger joint, with a faint residue of white powder clinging to its sides. Voila! The instrument of poisoning. Someone at Oakenhurst is playing a very dangerous game with very particular knowledge of toxins. St. Mary's Orphanage stood in a respectable but unadorned district of East London, its red brick walls and iron gates speaking of Victorian austerity. Inside, the air smelled faintly of chalk and floor polish. We were ushered to the office of Mrs. Bridges, the matron, a stout woman with watchful eyes and a manner that balanced authority with kindness. "Yes, I remember Thomas Grant," she said after a pause, when Poirot inquired. "A quiet boy, diligent in his studies, left us to enlist at 18 just before the war. And Mrs. Margaret Raines," Poirot pressed gently, "she supported your institution." "For more than 2 decades," Mrs. Bridges confirmed, her face softening. "She was among our most devoted patrons, not only donating, but often visiting, ensuring the children had books, clothing, and proper medical care. Her death was a great loss to us." "Did her generosity extend particularly to young Grant?" Poirot asked, his gaze never wavering. The matron hesitated, her fingers fussing with the papers on her desk. "That is more delicate. I am not at liberty to reveal private matters." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his tone grave. "Madame, Margaret Raines did not die a natural death. She was murdered, and I believe her special concern for Thomas Grant may hold the key to understanding why." At this, Mrs. Bridges turned pale, her composure shaken. "Murdered? But the papers said—" "The newspapers were misinformed," Poirot interrupted gently. "I must insist, madame." After a long silence, the matron nodded, her resolve breaking. "Very well. From the time Thomas was about 5 years old, Mrs. Raines took a special interest in him. She paid for private tutoring, ensured he had proper clothes, and even arranged for holidays away from the home. But she insisted that Thomas never learn who was behind this generosity." "And she gave no explanation?" I asked. "None, though—" Mrs. Bridges hesitated, lowering her voice. "I always suspected there was more to it. The boy's appearance, the timing of his arrival, it seemed too coincidental." "When did he come to St. Mary's?" Poirot asked swiftly. "In the summer of 1896, she replied. "He was left on our steps as an infant, wrapped in a blanket with nothing but a small silver medallion." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "This medallion, where is it now?" "It was given to Thomas when he left us," Mrs. Bridges explained, "his only possession from infancy." As we rose to leave, Mrs. Bridges promised to search her records for any further details. Poirot, visibly satisfied, remarked as our cab carried us back toward the station. "The pattern, Hastings, begins to reveal itself. But before we may see the whole design, we must recover the missing will of Mrs. Raines. I believe within its pages lies the ultimate truth." Chapter 6. Testament of Truths. We returned to Oakenhurst just as twilight draped its shadows across the grand estate. The house itself seemed to wait in tense silence, as though aware that truths long buried were on the cusp of being unearthed. Perkins, the ever-composed butler, admitted us with his usual courtesy, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. Poirot's first question was immediate. "How fares Miss Porter?" Perkins reported that Dr. Henderson had attended her closely through the afternoon. She was weak, but the worst seemed to have passed. Poirot nodded gravely before asking after the others. Perkins informed us that Mr. Weatherby had advised everyone to remain in the drawing room until our return. There we found them, each figure wrapped in a different shade of unease. Colonel Burrows stalked the hearth, his boots striking against the rug with restless impatience. Judith Raines sat upright in her chair, her fingers tapping in sharp rhythm against the armrest. Thomas Grant stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the dark gardens, as though searching for answers among the shifting silhouettes of the trees. Mrs. Lacey hovered nervously near the door, torn between duty and the desire to flee. Weatherby rose at our entrance, his face a mask of controlled civility. "Mr. Poirot, I trust your journey yielded results?" Poirot inclined his head. "Results most illuminating, monsieur. Yet before I speak of London, tell me, what has transpired here in our absence?" Weatherby began to assure him that nothing of note had occurred, but Colonel Burrows cut across sharply. "Nothing, save that we are treated as prisoners within this house while you chase shadows." Poirot met his glare evenly. "Not shadows, Colonel. 2 women have been poisoned within these walls. One is dead, the other barely escaped the same fate. That is not conjecture, it is fact." Mrs. Lacey, pale and trembling, whispered, "But who would wish Miss Porter harm? She has served faithfully for decades. She has no enemies." Poirot's voice softened. "Perhaps not enemies, madame, but knowledge can be as dangerous as hatred, and Miss Porter may have known something too perilous for another to allow her to live." The statement was met with a heavy silence until the Colonel barked impatiently, "Enough riddles, sir. Did your London trip reveal anything of substance?" "Indeed it did," Poirot replied calmly, settling himself with deliberate composure. "Mrs. Raines provided for Mr. Thomas Grant throughout his youth at St. Mary's Orphanage. She saw to his clothing, his books, his education, yet she arranged that he should never know the identity of his benefactress." The room's attention swung to Grant, who had turned ashen. I had no idea," he stammered. "We were told those gifts came from charitable strangers. Why would she single me out? I never met her until the letter arrived." Poirot's gaze lingered on him. "That question, monsieur, we shall soon answer. But first, Mr. Weatherby, would you kindly retrieve Mrs. Raines's diary from the safe?" As the solicitor departed, Judith Raines broke her silence, her voice edged with tension. "Are you implying that my cousin carried some hidden tie to this man, something the rest of us were ignorant of?" "It appears so, mademoiselle," Poirot replied evenly. Weatherby returned at that moment, diary in hand. Poirot accepted it but did not yet open the volume. "Before we consult these pages," he said, turning to Mrs. Lacey, "may I ask, you prepared Mrs. Raines's tea on the day of her death?" Startled, the housekeeper nodded. "Yes, sir. I prepared it as always. She was particular about her afternoon tea, but nothing seemed unusual." "And who had access to it before it reached her room?" "No one. I never let it out of my sight." Poirot considered this quietly. "And Miss Porter? Did you serve her tea this afternoon?" Mrs. Lacey shook her head. "No, sir. I was about to, when I found her collapsed near the pond." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Then it appears her tea was provided by another, someone whose intentions were less than kind." He finally opened the diary, his eyes flicking over its pages. Then he paused and turned to me. "Hastings, a small task, if you please. In the library, behind the 3rd volume of Shakespeare's collected works, you will find something of note." Perplexed, I obeyed, and indeed, tucked behind the heavy spine of the bard's plays was a sealed envelope. I returned with it, handing it silently to Poirot, who smiled with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Raines confided in her diary that she trusted her books more than her safe, and she was wise to do so. The envelope was carefully opened, revealing handwritten sheets. Poirot scanned them before declaring, "Mesdames et messieurs, we have found the missing will." The air thickened with shock. Colonel Burrows demanded to know its contents. Poirot handed the document to Weatherby. With some hesitation, the solicitor read aloud. Mrs. Raines had left Oakenhurst and the majority of her estate to Thomas Grant. The rest of the company gasped, and Grant himself all but collapsed into a chair. "But why?" he whispered. "Why leave everything to me, a stranger?" Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "You were never a stranger, monsieur. Though you knew it not, you are of her blood." The will revealed the truth. Thomas Grant was the son of Richard Raines, Margaret's brother-in-law, who had perished in a boating accident alongside his wife when Thomas was an infant. Believed drowned, the child had instead survived and been left anonymously at St. Mary's. Margaret had discovered this truth years later and ensured his welfare in secret, but never dared reveal it openly. Her will was her attempt at atonement. Thomas sat motionless, whispering, "I am a Raines." The silver medallion he carried since childhood, bearing the Raines family crest, confirmed his identity beyond doubt. Even Weatherby, peering at it through his spectacles, was astonished. The company was stunned into silence. Judith Raines's face was rigid, her voice carefully controlled as she murmured, "So I am not to inherit Oakenhurst after all." Poirot inclined his head, explaining that she would receive a generous legacy, but the estate passed lawfully to Thomas. Judith excused herself with icy composure, leaving the drawing room under Poirot's watchful gaze. He turned to me with a subtle smile. "Mon ami, observe closely at dinner tonight. I have set a little trap, and I suspect our murderer may be unable to resist it." The evening stretched before us, heavy with expectation. Somewhere within Oakenhurst, truth and death were waiting to reveal themselves. Chapter 7. The Orchestrated Malady. Dinner at Oakenhurst that evening carried with it an unnatural tension, like a stage awaiting its final act. The revelation of Thomas Grant's lineage still hung in the air, cloaking the company in a strange silence. Grant himself looked as though he were moving through a dream, scarcely able to grasp his transformation from foundling to heir of Oakenhurst. Colonel Burrows, normally blustery, confined himself to clipped remarks about the food and weather, his jaw set in grim lines. Judith Raines had regained her composure, but the cool detachment in her gaze was betrayed each time her eyes flicked toward Thomas. Weatherby did his best to maintain polite conversation, though the effort rang hollow. Even Mrs. Lacey, whom Poirot had insisted should join the dinner rather than serve it, seemed acutely uncomfortable, her hands trembling each time she lifted her fork. Dr. Henderson appeared last, explaining that Miss Porter was resting quietly before slipping into his place at the table. Poirot, curiously, was subdued throughout the first two courses. He pushed his food around with barely a taste, his eyes sharp and watchful, as though he were studying each member of the party instead of the dishes before him. Only when the main course of roasted pheasant was served did he at last stir with apparent interest. "Tell me, Doctor," Poirot began casually, carving a delicate portion of the bird, "what manner of poison would you say afflicted both Mrs. Raines and Miss Porter?" Dr. Henderson blinked in surprise at being addressed so directly. "Without a laboratory test, I cannot be certain, but their symptoms, difficulty breathing, bluing of the lips, the suddenness of the attack, suggest something akin to cyanide. A most uncommon substance for the layman to acquire, is it not?" Poirot mused, lifting his wineglass but not drinking. "Generally speaking, yes," the doctor replied, "though it can sometimes be found in certain photographic or horticultural compounds." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "How fascinating! I believe photography is a pastime of yours, Colonel Burrows." The colonel snapped his head up. "Are you accusing me, sir?" Poirot merely shrugged, his tone light. "Not at all, mon colonel. I only remark upon the coincidence. One must consider every possibility." Burroughs admitted through gritted teeth that he had dabbled in the hobby, though, he added quickly, Miss Porter herself had once been a keen photographer. "She was hardly the timid creature she seems now," he muttered. "Once, she had ambitions before life bound her to this household." Poirot inclined his head thoughtfully, but before the conversation could progress, his expression shifted. A sudden grimace crossed his face, and he pressed a hand to his stomach. His complexion turned ashen. "Monsieur Poirot, are you ill?" Weatherby asked anxiously. Poirot tried to wave it away, but another spasm bent him forward, his fingers trembling as they reached for his glass, only to set it down untasted. "Perhaps you should rest, sir," Dr. Henderson urged, half rising from his chair. Poirot nodded weakly. Perhaps you are right. Hastings, if you please." Alarmed, I sprang to his side. His forehead glistened with perspiration, and his legs seemed barely to support him. Together with the doctor's assistance, I helped him from the dining room and up the staircase. Once we had closed the door to his chamber, however, Poirot straightened at once, colour returning to his cheeks. The tremor in his hands was gone, as if it had never been. "Poirot!" I exclaimed. "What madness!" He silenced me with a finger raised. "Our murderer must believe their scheme is succeeding. Doctor, you performed admirably. Now we must use their assumption to our advantage." Dr. Henderson gave a grim nod. "What do you require?" "Evidence," said Poirot simply. "Evidence of how the poison was delivered. I believe it waits for us in Miss Porter's chambers." He turned to me. "Hastings, you will remain here and make suitable noises of distress should anyone approach. Doctor, with me." Before I could protest, they were gone, leaving me feeling both foolish and nervous in equal measure. A short while later came the expected knock. I pulled the blankets across the bed and opened the door a crack. Judith Raines stood there, her face composed yet anxious. "How is Mr. Poirot?" she asked quickly. I saw the doctor leave in such haste. I feigned worry. "Quite unwell, I'm afraid. The doctor suspects food poisoning. He has gone to fetch medicine." Judith's eyes narrowed faintly. "Perhaps some tea might soothe him?" Poirot's earlier warnings rang in my ears, and I declined at once. "The doctor insists on nothing by mouth for now, but thank you." She departed without further word, leaving me uneasy. 20 minutes passed before Poirot and the doctor returned, Henderson carrying a small leather case. Poirot's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Success, mon ami. We have secured the evidence needed to unmask our culprit." Before I could press him for details, a shrill cry echoed through the corridor. Mrs. Lacey came rushing up, wringing her hands. "It's Miss Porter! She's vanished from her room!" The household erupted into confusion. Poirot wasted no time. "We must search at once. Hastings, accompany Colonel Burroughs on the ground floor. Mr. Weatherby, you and the doctor search this level. Mrs. Lacey, check the servants' wing. I shall take the attic." Burroughs and I moved through the shadowed rooms below, his muttered curses punctuating our search. "A queer business, Hastings," he growled. "First Poirot collapses, then Porter disappears. As if—" He stopped short. "As if what, Colonel?" He shook his head brusquely. "Nothing. Just thinking aloud." We were nearing the conservatory when Poirot's urgent call echoed from the kitchen. He stood by the open cellar door, a lamp casting eerie shadows. "Listen," he commanded. In the stillness, we heard it. A scraping, dragging sound, followed by a dull thud. "She is below," Poirot declared. "But not alone. Hastings, your revolver." I touched the reassuring shape in my pocket. Burrows bristled at being told to remain behind, insisting he was no invalid. Poirot allowed him to join, but bade him keep his distance. The cellar stretched in cold darkness, chambers branching from the stone corridor. The noises drew us toward the wine room. Poirot lifted the lamp, revealing a shocking tableau. A figure kneeling beside an unconscious woman. "That is far enough," Poirot called sharply. The figure turned, and to my astonishment, it was Miss Evelyn Porter herself, yet her face carried no weakness now, only hard defiance. On the floor beside her lay Judith Raines, gagged and bound with strips of linen. I gasped aloud. "Miss Porter, but then who?" Poirot's voice was grim. "An old ruse, but effective. The frail invalid draws sympathy while her enemies are eliminated, but her disguise falters when evidence is found." Miss Porter's hand darted toward her pocket, but Poirot raised a warning. "I would not, madame. Hastings is an excellent shot, and the colonel's reflexes are not so easily dulled." Slowly, her hand withdrew, empty. "You understand nothing," she whispered. Poirot's tone was steady. "On the contrary, I understand all. Margaret Raines was silenced before she could reveal Thomas's identity, and Judith nearly joined her when she grew suspicious. You masked yourself as a companion, but beneath the facade, your ambition was ruthless." In the wavering lamplight of the cellar, Evelyn Porter's years of deception stood exposed. The loyal attendant had been an assassin in disguise, and Oakenhurst's secrets had finally caught up with her. Chapter 8. The denouement at dusk. The drawing room of Oakenhurst carried a suffocating heaviness that evening, as though the walls themselves absorbed the tension that now bound us all together. Outside, the sun slipped beneath the horizon, drenching the gardens in long coppery shadows, while the fading light turned the air inside the house thick and oppressive. At Poirot's request, every key figure had gathered. Colonel Burrows, stiff and guarded. Thomas Grant, still pale with disbelief at his newfound lineage. Weatherby, somber. Dr. Henderson, alert. Mrs. Lacey, fluttering nervously. And Judith Raines, wan but steady after her recent ordeal. Across the room, Evelyn Porter sat apart, her hands bound, her silence watched closely by a local inspector. Though she refused to speak, her defiance radiated like a shield. Poirot positioned himself before the fireplace, his small frame exuding a quiet authority that silenced the room without effort. Following her arrest in the cellar, Miss Porter had offered nothing by way of confession, but now Poirot's tone carried the finality of judgment. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "we are gathered to hear the truth of how Mrs. Margaret Raines met her untimely death. Not by natural weakness of the body, but by the cold deliberation of poison. The facts, as we now see them, are undeniable. Margaret Raines uncovered the true identity of Thomas Grant, that he was no orphan of chance, but the child of Richard Raines's brother, long believed lost in infancy. Having supported him from the shadows, she intended to make him publicly her heir. Yet before her new will could be enacted, she was murdered." Poirot turned his gaze directly on the accused. "And the hand that administered the poison belonged to none other than her trusted companion of more than 2 decades, Miss Evelyn Porter." A gasp shivered through the room. Thomas Grant leaned forward, his face a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. "But why? What could she possibly gain?" Poirot inclined his head as though waiting for the question. "Ah, mon cher, the motive is not written in the future, but in the past. Miss Porter, would you prefer to explain?" "No." His voice softened into steel. "Then I shall." He began pacing slowly, each step measured, his eyes fixed upon the bound woman. The tale does not commence with Miss Porter's entry into service, but nearly 30 years prior, on a summer's day when a boat carrying Richard and Eleanor Raines and their infant capsized. It was deemed an accident, but mes amis, was it truly so? For Mrs. Margaret Raines, widow and guardian of the family legacy, began to suspect that the child had not perished. Her inquiries led her to St. Mary's Orphanage, where she found Thomas Grant, placed there as an infant with only a medallion to mark his origin. From that day, she resolved that the boy would inherit what was rightfully his. Poirot's voice sharpened. But there was one person who could not allow this truth to surface. For more than 20 years, Evelyn Porter cultivated trust, loyalty, and proximity, yet Evelyn Porter was not Evelyn Porter at all. Before taking her role as companion, she was known as Eliza Tennant, cousin to Eleanor Raines, and once governess to the household. After the boating tragedy, she disappeared into obscurity, her name erased, her new identity carefully crafted, but her ambition never faltered. A murmur rippled through the gathering. Judith Raines's face drained of colour. Weatherby muttered a prayer. Colonel Burrows leaned forward sharply. "Are you implying—" Poirot cut him off with a raised hand. "I am stating it plainly, mon colonel. Miss Porter, Eliza Tennant, sought to eliminate Richard and Eleanor that fateful day. Believing their child drowned as well, she placed herself near Margaret, ensuring that in time the estate would fall to her. Patience, you see, was her greatest weapon." For a long moment, Evelyn Porter's expression remained carved from stone, but Poirot was relentless. He reached into his pocket and produced a silver locket, which he placed on the table for all to see. This, found among her belongings, contains a photograph of Eleanor with the inscription, "To Eliza with love." A keepsake too precious to discard, though it betrayed her identity. Moreover, Dr. Henderson has confirmed the poison used matched photographic chemicals, and the vial near the garden bore her fingerprints. And finally, Mrs. Raines's diary, where she recorded her growing suspicions about the woman who had been her companion for 23 years. At last, Evelyn Porter's composure cracked. Fury sparked in her eyes, her voice a low hiss. She had no right. The Raines' fortune should have been mine. Eleanor knew it. She promised me security. But then she married Richard, had her child, and I was nothing but the poor cousin, the forgotten governess. "The accident," I breathed, horrified. "You tampered with the boat?" A twisted smile flickered across her lips. "A simple repair, poorly made. Too simple. If not for that meddling fisherman who plucked the brat from the water, none of this would have been necessary." Her voice faltered into bitterness. "For 30 years I believed him dead. And then Margaret with her sudden revelation, all my years of sacrifice undone in a single night." The room was silent but for the crackle of the fire. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through like a blade. "And so you killed. Not for justice, but for greed, Mademoiselle Tennant. And in doing so, you revealed not your strength, but your folly." The inspector stepped forward to signal the end of her charade. As Miss Porter, no, Miss Tennant, was led away, the weight of 3 decades of deception seemed to lift from Oakenhurst, leaving only shock and grief in its wake. Miss Porter's composure began to unravel as her bitterness spilled out into the room. She turned to Thomas Grant, her face pale but twisted with suppressed fury. "You should have died with them," she hissed. "If you had, everything would have been mine in the end. I earned it. 23 years of tending to Margaret's whims, listening to her endless stories, drafting her letters, overseeing her charities, always sacrificing, always serving. And for what?" Poirot's eyes narrowed, his voice calm but cutting. And then came her discovery regarding Mr. Grant. That was the beginning of the end for you, was it not, mademoiselle? Miss Porter gave a short, harsh laugh. She could barely contain herself. She was thrilled, deliriously so, could not wait to reveal her precious truth to her darling nephew. I tried to stop her, told her it would only lead to scandal. But no, Margaret Raines had to do what she believed was right. Dr. Henderson's voice cut through the silence. So you poisoned her. Mercifully, Miss Porter replied without hesitation. In her sleep, as though nature itself had claimed her. A gentle end, far gentler than what Richard and Helena endured. Her gaze shifted to Judith Raines, hard and unflinching. You, however, were a complication. I had not expected you to survive the first attempt. Judith shuddered, her voice trembling. I saw you that day, leaving Margaret's study with papers clutched in your hand. You looked guilty. That was when I first realized something was very wrong. Poirot inclined his head. A single overlooked detail, a flaw in what you believed a flawless design. And when I uncovered the truth about Thomas Grant's identity, you realized you would need to strike again. Thomas, pale and shaken, finally found his voice. But how, Poirot? How did you even know to look for me? And how on earth did Mrs. Raines discover that I had survived after all these years? Poirot's tone softened, carrying a trace of irony. Ah, monsieur, therein lies the greatest twist of all. It was Miss Porter herself who led Margaret to the truth. Unintentionally, of course. Grant frowned, bewildered. What do you mean? The medallion you wore, Poirot explained. It bore the Raines family crest. When you appeared in a newspaper article last year among the war veterans, Margaret saw it. She recognized it instantly and began to investigate. That recognition set everything in motion. Mr. Weatherby, the family solicitor, stepped in quietly. I found that very article among her private papers. Your name was printed clearly beneath the photograph, and that gave her the lead she needed. Poirot nodded. Yes, and thus the chain of events began. A chain that dragged a 30-year-old crime out of the shadows and delivered justice at last. Miss Porter's defiance seemed to collapse, leaving her drained and lifeless. As the inspector stepped forward to escort her away, she paused only once, her eyes fixed on Thomas. You have his eyes, she whispered, voice flat and hollow. Richard's eyes. I should have known the moment I saw you. When she was gone, silence settled heavily over the drawing room. It was Thomas who finally broke it. What happens now? He asked, still dazed. Mr. Weatherby adjusted his spectacles, his tone steady. Now, my boy, we proceed with Mrs. Raines's will. Oakenhurst is yours, along with all the duties, burdens, and history that accompany it. The autumn twilight deepened beyond the tall windows as the family absorbed the weight of his words. Judith Raines sat with quiet relief, while the Colonel showed a reluctant acceptance. For Thomas, bewilderment lingered, yet a new future stretched before him. The Raines saga, 3 decades of silence and deception, had reached its final act. Later that night, as Poirot and I prepared for our return to London, I found my friend at his window, gazing out across the moonlit gardens. A satisfactory conclusion, Hastings, he murmured. Satisfactory, yes, I replied thoughtfully, but also tragic. Miss Porter wasted her life chasing a dream doomed from the start. She served faithfully, only to let bitterness consume her. Poirot sighed, his expression grave. It is the way with many crimes, mon ami. The criminal grows blind to their own imperfections. And yet even with her failings, Margaret Raines tried in the end to make amends. There is a lesson in that. The following morning, as we departed Oakenhurst, I glanced back. Thomas Grant stood upon the great stone steps, framed by the rising sun, the reluctant heir of a legacy reclaimed from the shadows. Margaret's last will had done its work, restoring justice to the dead and offering renewal to the living. And once again, it was my friend's little grey cells that had guided us there. Scene by scene, analysis of Hercule Poirot and the Last Will. Scene 1. The reading of the will. The story begins in a grand drawing room as the family gathers for the reading of Mr. Abernethy's will. Tension fills the air, each relative silently weighing what they might inherit. Poirot, though not a family member, listens with keen interest. What should have been a formal procedure instead stirs up suspicions, as certain remarks in the will seem oddly pointed, hinting at unfinished business. Theme. The opening reminds us that wealth often breeds suspicion, and legacies can divide more than they unite. Viewer. Question. Do you think a will reveals more about a person's fortune or about the grudges they leave behind? Scene 2. Uneasy inheritance. The distribution of the estate sparks unease. While some members of the family receive generous portions, others are left disappointed and jealous glances begin to circulate. Poirot notices subtle shifts in expression, envy disguised as politeness, irritation masked by forced gratitude. The will, instead of offering closure, has opened fresh wounds. Theme. Human emotions are never satisfied by material gain alone. Comparison fuels resentment. Viewer question. If you were in such a family gathering, would you feel relieved by fairness or suspicious of hidden motives? Scene 3. The first whispers of doubt. Shortly after, quiet conversations begin among the heirs. Some believe the will may have been manipulated, others whisper of hidden enemies. Poirot takes note of these murmurs, recognizing that truth often surfaces first as rumor. The idea that the will was not entirely straightforward becomes the seed of a growing mystery. Theme. Doubt, once planted, spreads quickly and changes how people see one another. Viewer. Question. Do you think suspicion naturally arises in families after death, or only when money is involved? Scene 4. Poirot's observations. Poirot begins to study the heirs more closely, analyzing gestures, tones, and inconsistencies in their stories. He senses that beneath the polished appearances lie secrets ready to unravel. Each person has something to gain or something to hide. This careful observation plants the first clues toward untangling the truth. Theme. Observation, more than interrogation, often reveals the true character of people. Viewer. Question. Do you think small gestures, like a nervous glance or a slip of tone, can betray guilt more than words? Scene 5. The past comes to light. Details of Mr. Abernethy's past emerge. Old business dealings, strained relationships, and subtle grievances that reach beyond the grave. The heirs discover that inheritance is not simply about possessions, but about long histories of rivalry and resentment. Poirot listens carefully, noting how past wounds bleed into the present conflict. Theme. The past has a way of shaping the present, especially when pride and money intertwine. Viewer. Question. Do you believe old family grudges can ever truly be buried, or do they always resurface? Scene 6. A family divided. The heirs begin to turn against one another. Accusations rise, voices sharpen, and the reading of the will transforms into a battlefield of suspicion. Each relative points to another as a potential manipulator, while Poirot watches calmly, letting the storm reveal its patterns. Division itself becomes the greatest clue, showing how greed corrodes trust. Theme. Inheritance exposes true character. What lies beneath civility emerges when wealth is at stake. Viewer. Question. Do you think money strengthens families or tears them apart more often? Scene 7. Poirot assembles the truth. After careful analysis, Poirot gathers the heirs to explain what he has pieced together. He retraces the steps, connecting half-spoken remarks, missing documents, and the psychology of envy. His explanation exposes the subtle manipulations at play, revealing not a curse of fate, but the schemes of human ambition. Theme. Truth often lies not in the obvious, but in the small, overlooked details. Viewer. Question. Do you enjoy mysteries where the solution feels inevitable once explained, or ones that remain shocking until the end? Scene 8. Justice and resolution. In the closing moments, Poirot reveals the guilty hand and restores order to the household. The will, once a symbol of division, becomes the stage for truth. Those who plotted are unmasked, while others come to see that wealth never erases human flaws. Poirot leaves with quiet satisfaction, having once more proven that patience, logic, and observation outlast greed. Theme. Justice does not always come from the law, it comes from uncovering truth. Viewer. Question. Do you think Poirot's way of revealing guilt in front of everyone is the best approach, or would quiet justice be better? Let's discuss key characters. At the center of the case stands Hercule Poirot, whose sharp observation and patience untangle the disputes surrounding the will. His calm presence contrasts the rising tension in the household, making him both mediator and truth-seeker. Alongside him is Captain Hastings, acting as companion and chronicler, often voicing the audience's perspective as suspicion grows. The deceased Mr. Abernethy drives the narrative from beyond the grave. His will sparks the conflict, and his past relationships shed light on the family's divisions. Among the heirs, each reveals layers of ambition and resentment. Hugo Abernethy, the patriarch's son, inherits but also carries the weight of expectation. Mrs. Hugo Abernethy, his wife, becomes a protective figure for her household while navigating suspicion. And Ronald, their child, represents innocence caught in the shadow of greed. Other relatives circle the inheritance with unease. Roger Abernethy, a cousin, is viewed with distrust, but ultimately proves to be more bystander than conspirator. Miss Saunders, serving as governess, provides stability in the home, yet becomes a silent witness to the tension. John Gardner, acting as secretary, emerges as a marginal but watchful figure, his presence highlighting how outsiders perceive the family's unraveling. Later, peripheral names appear in the extended case, such as Lester, Dyer, and Wu Ling, each tied to a parallel investigation that reveals how greed and deception extend beyond a single household. Collectively, these characters form the fractured circle that Poirot methodically examines until truth finally surfaces. My final thoughts. In the end, The Last Will is not a story about documents or inheritances, but about the way greed and suspicion expose the truth of human character. The Abernethy family gathered to hear the will hoping for security, yet what surfaced instead were rivalries, hidden grudges, and envy disguised as civility. Poirot shows us once again that beneath every polished exterior lies a motive waiting to be uncovered, and that true justice comes not from money, but from clarity and reason. The tale reminds us that legacies can divide as much as they provide, and only honesty can outlast the weight of inheritance. Thank you for joining me on this journey into Christie's world of intrigue. Do you believe wealth brings more peace or more conflict to families? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your view. And if you enjoy unraveling mysteries where human nature is the real puzzle, make sure to subscribe now. Each week, we uncover another story where Poirot proves that nothing remains hidden from his little grey cells.